And with the high energy combat that you're using or other encounter, instead of just a beginning phase, you can get your players out of that sort of talking to each other and looking at their phones and right into the action. Oh, hello there. Now, how did we get to that point? That's a really good question. In order to figure that out, I think we're going to have to go back to the beginning. And it all started with an introduction. I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone,
Hi,
and welcome
to
Arcane Mark. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can steal the narrative technique of in media res beginnings from literature in order to start your adventures in the middle. So, basically, the idea here with in media res, or starting in the middle, in the middle beginning, is that sometimes the introduction or beginning of a book or a movie or a story, if you just start with getting all the facts in and getting to know the situation, isn't as engaging as some of the stuff that happens right in the middle of the story. And when it comes to that fact, you can just start in the middle and then later go back and explain the beginning.
So when you see that in a novel or a play or something like that, those sorts of beginnings might be fairly confusing because you are seeing all sorts of things and you don't have the context to necessarily understand what you're seeing, and then you have to sort of piece that together as you go along. So there are some aspects of how you do this in a tabletop RPG that are going to be different from the way that that happens whenever you have one author who's writing everything. Because the players still need to know enough about what's going on in order to be able to have their characters respond to it. But they don't need to have the entire story.
That's right. Like in the Odyssey, you could just start in the middle and then Odysseus can explain what the heck is going on because, in this case, Homer kind of is writing everything or telling it aloud, really, since it was an oral tradition, and knows where the story's going to go. But when you've got players with their characters and you just say, okay, now, you shipwrecked on this island and all your other people are dead from the previous encounters, and we're going to move forward from here. They'll be like, wait a minute, where did they all die from the previous encounters? What the heck is going on? It's not always easy to do an in media res beginning when you have to work together with others. So you can't just say, I'm going to do it and then do it and have a immediate success. You need to get some buy-in. You need to explain it to your players. You can't just sort of surprise them with it like we did at the beginning of this episode where we just kind of started in media res to give sort of an example of an empowerment promise that sort of pretended to be in the middle. You have to let them know and be like, look, I want to start this adventure in the middle. Or even tell them, I want to start all of our sessions using in media res to sort of get people engaged, because I noticed that when we started in the sense of okay, so let's just remember what happened last time, and this is what we were doing, and then
get everything started. Someone about how you're going to get to where you're going.
And then maybe you found that you only have a few hours for each session, and that you always spend the entire first hour getting people's brains locked in into the adventure and away from what they were doing before, and that the transition doesn't work as well. And you want to try something new, so you say, okay, not just for the adventure as a whole, but every session or a lot of them, we're going to try to start in media res. So you talk to your players, make sure they're okay with that. There might be someone in your group who's like, I don't know, I'll try it, but I'm going to have to warn you that those kind of things confuse me even when I see them on a TV show, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it. And you can talk honestly with them about that, but let's assume they're willing to give it a try. So if it's a new campaign with new characters you're starting in media res, then first you need to make sure your session 0 is a pretty beefy session 0 that is sufficient to carry you into the middle, especially since starting in the middle presumes some amount of action from the player characters already. It means that they're going to need to trust you to know their characters, and in order for that to happen, they're going to need to be able to explain their characters to you so they can get a sense you know the characters well enough to put them right into the middle of things in a way that is true to their characters.
So, like, for example, if you start an adventure with, you know, the alarms blaring because the PCs have, you know, broken into an area and grabbed the treasure that they were looking for, and now,
they were like, we're all paladins.
Like,
we've sworn an oath never to steal from anybody or break the law. Why did you start it like that?
Yeah.
And then, but if they really trust you, you can be like, look, you know, you do have that oath, but you do have the thing where a higher aspect of your oath is above that. Isn't it interesting that it started with you here in a place you never would have expected to be? Let's roll back to see why. And if your group trusts you, they might be like, oh, wow, that is really exciting. Okay, well, first let's get out of this scrape, and then you need to tell us how we got here because this is pretty ridiculous. But if they don't trust you, they'll be like, no, there's no way. This never would have happened. This has broken my suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
This is it.
Especially if the situation that the PCs are in is something that, you know, that the characters and their abilities, they would say, like, we should have been able to get out of that. So it's like, oh, yeah, you know, you guys are in
prison. All of your magic items were stolen and eaten by a Gru, and now they no longer exist anymore. Your allies were slaughtered for a ritual that summoned a demon lord, and you're imprisoned by the demon lord. And but fortunately, you see an opportunity to break out, and they're like, "Wait a minute." Yeah, you started in the middle, but this is like horrible. Yeah. Why did we skip the parts where this happened?
So first of all, this goes to sort of like we could have been able to prevent all these terrible things from happening with our abilities, but there's also ones that might be like sort of a simpler thing. It's like, yeah, you know, you're caught out in the snowstorm, and you're like have to try to find some way to survive, and they're like, well, wait a minute, like we have ridiculous survival skills. Why did we get caught out in the snowstorm?
I literally took the weather watcher feat, which is like almost useless, that allows me to know what the weather will be up to 3 days in advance. How did we not know that there was going to be a snowstorm?
So you want to make sure that you have like a reasonable path for how the PCs got to the point where they are. But another thing to consider though is that you, as the GM, are not the only author of the story. So it may be that the players can play a role in helping to fill in how did we get here.
Yeah, you could ask them. You could be like, yeah, you do have the weather watcher feat. You know the feat best. How did you miss this snowstorm? And they'd be like, well, it says if there's a magically created weather that is not the natural weather, that it can't predict that someone's going to use that ritual. And you're like, yeah, probably is that, but that's a pretty high level ritual. And then another player would be like, I noticed that hag covens could do that ritual, and they're not that high level of a monster. So it'd be like, yeah, so I think your weather character knows that only that magic is going to break their thing, and your character knows about hag covens because you're a changeling. So maybe you suspect that a hag coven might be responsible for this blizzard, even though you don't know for sure. So that's a way you could potentially bring your players in, even with that ridiculous situation where they took a really obscure feat, and then you're starting in the middle, like kind of seem to almost negate the feat, and suddenly it starts writing a story, and they get interested, and the changeling's like, yeah, it could be a hag coven. I wonder if it's connected to my hag mother, and they're trying to slow us down in the snowstorm for some reason. And then you can start getting into things collaboratively rather than you having to be the mastermind who completely determines how you're going to start.
And there are some games that are particularly high-style games that are really built around this idea that you just jump right in and then you figure out later on what you had prepared.
That's why in the description, if you look underneath the top, like below like the thumbs up and the join button and all of those, I said for Pathfinder, D&D, and most tabletop RPG adventures usually start at the beginning. But actually, in some RPGs, Blades in the Dark is an example, you don't necessarily start in the beginning. You actually start where the action is. And so Blades in the Dark specifically has a mechanic for this, where you roll a check to get rid of the situation of, oh, we could have started it a better way than this by just being more competent. You roll a check that determines how well the stuff that you're kind of skipping or fast forwarding through to get to the action went, in terms of like a generally like a it's all controlled, everything's going to plan. It's kind of normal. Normally things go a little bit off, or this is desperate, it was all screwed up. And it's the engagement check. And then at that point, the GM brings you into the action, and if you needed to have done anything in the past, you use flashbacks to flashback that you did that. So you can actually use that style in Pathfinder, D&D, or other games too, if you're not sure and you don't want it to necessarily be, okay, the demons killed everybody and took all your stuff, and be like, all right, everybody, we're going to take a mechanic from another RPG and we're going to roll a check to see just how well certain actions that, like, were a whole sort of cluster of interactions that you guys would have done and the enemies would have done, how well did they go for you? And we'll add in different bonuses. Let's say you're playing D20 like Pathfinder D&D. We'll roll a D20 for this. I'm going to give you guys the basic DC is whatever it is. And then we'll give you, it's not using any of your skills. We're going to give you bonuses based on, like, the things that you guys have. So your Demon Slayer weapon is very powerful against demons. We're going to give a bonus for that. Last session, you, Rogue, were able to, like, sneak in and spy on the demons, so you know more about what they want to do, so you'll get a bonus for that. And so we're rolling at a plus 10 against a difficulty of 15. So if you get a 5 or above, then you're in pretty good shape. If you get if you roll a 15 on the die, that's going to be a 25. That's a critical success. So everything's smooth. If you get a 4, 3, or 2 on the die, that's a failure. So the demons are doing well. And if you get a natural 1, oh my goodness, the demons have a huge advantage.
So another thing you can do then is also take that idea of having, like, based on how well they do, a certain number of things that they can say that they had already prepared that happen to be useful for the situation. So it could be like, oh, well, good thing it's like, oh, yeah, the blizzard came in. Good thing we packed extra cold weather gear, things like that. So especially, it makes sense for this to sort of divide out the things between, yes, obviously you would have been able to prepare for that because you knew that was coming, and things that are, like, a little more of a stretch.
Yes, and if you did that, if you want to use something like an engagement roll from Blades in the Dark in your Pathfinder D&D campaign, you could actually determine how many of these stretch things they can do based on how well that roll went. You can be like, okay, the obvious things are obvious. You obviously could have done that. You obviously brought your snow clothes because even though you didn't know there was going to be a blizzard, it's a cold area.
It's a cold area. But, like, if it was like a tropical area and then, like, suddenly a magic blizzard came in, then it would be more of a stretch to have your...
And then you could be like, okay, so if we critically fail, you get 0 things that are a stretch to have because you were caught with your pants down, basically. If you regularly fail, you guys could still do 1 thing, maybe. And then you say, like, you could do more things. Maybe it's like you can have 3 special flashback preparation things on a success and 5 on a critical success because you guys just know what you're doing and everything's going fine. That's a way to do it. You can handle it. And because you used the D20 to determine things that was based on what the players and their characters were doing, it can also feel like it was earned more, and including the bad situation can feel more earned than it was just like, I'm going to start you in the middle, and that horrible thing I said where all your allies were dead and your items were destroyed. And so, like, that doesn't feel as earned if just the GM just decided, I'm going to do that, and there was no reason that this happened other than my whims.
And Rowan's talking about the GM doing that by starting players in the middle of a combat. Absolutely.
That's very tied into what I was talking about when I said you might want to do it every session instead of just at the beginning of the campaign. The technique of using action or just fast forwarding to the middle and then going back to show how you got there to get your players out of sort of the mindset of just talking to each other before you technically started on their phones is something that can really help, like, build excitement and just kind of shift people's mindset into the game. And for some groups, that's really, really effective. In fact, now we're back to the part that we started at the beginning of this episode where we said basically the same thing as that and then went back to the beginning.
If you start this session by basically being like, all right, so you open the door and you hear it's like you open the door and you hear the ferocious growling of the dire wolves, and they're, like, lunging at you. Roll for initiative or whatever.
Yep.
And then it's like, okay, what's the door? Where were we? Why are there dire wolves inside?
In fact, you can use a this immediate race action beginning to put in like a challenging encounter that's really important to the story. But in fact, a trivial encounter is generally an excellent palate cleanser way to start things because it's fast and it's easy. And since it came out of nowhere, just suddenly at the beginning of the session, as you're sort of like, let's start with the action, you could put more build up directly, clues and build up and tension raising before you get to like the big actual encounter. It won't eat that much of your session time because it's a trivial encounter and the PCs can defeat it pretty quickly. They're going to get a rush of excitement and sort of success and a feeling of accomplishment from winning it pretty easily. And so it won't bog things down.
Yeah. And so you want to be looking in that case for things that are going to drive action. So like, this isn't like, you're not going to use this technique for like, yes, now you're in the middle of a long and detailed conversation in which much context was needed to understand things.
And that's when the other person says, "How dare you, sir?" And you're like, what? How dare I? What? Yeah. What was this even about?
But if there's a situation where the kinds of responses are like, okay, we need to act quickly, we need to like escape this area, we need to fight this encounter, we need to deal with this storm, we need to, the types of responses that are available to you aren't ones that are going to require a huge amount of context. Because like if the PCs are in a room and whatever else is in that room is actively trying to kill them, like, they're not going to be able to stop and say, yes, wait, let us have a long discussion.
Absolutely. And so, at that point, you need to decide how you're going to start at the beginning, what your sort of action-y way, what you're starting in the middle will be. Get your players on board. Use your players to bounce things off if what you're saying doesn't make sense to them, and because they're part of the story too. So you don't have the power of Homer to just start Odysseus shipwrecked with everybody dead. And so when you use these techniques, you can get the players to get really excited or interested in the immediate race beginning. In fact, there's some players who can really engage with even the story and the narrative more when you use it. It tends to be players that you might find love combat and action, and it doesn't mean that they hate stories and narrative, but they sometimes seem like they're tuning out in some of your other sessions, even though like maybe they're great role players sometimes, but other times they seem like they're tuning out and you can't tell why. You might be able to determine that in media race beginning, where you start with the action, actually leads to those sessions where they are being great role players and getting engaged with the story, because just what happened is, for the way their brain works, the slow roll up at the beginning just kind of would lose them, or they get distracted and they wouldn't be able to get as engaged until something really exciting got their blood pumping and got them into their character. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that this kind of beginning is always good. Yeah, like I was saying before, there's some players who just like, as a person, even when they're not playing a tabletop RPG, they kind of get confused by those TV episodes that jump around, or those movies that are constantly cutting back and forth in time, and they like things to go from beginning to end.
Sometimes you'll have just completed like a big exciting arc, and it makes sense to have like a more of like a downtime and type things going on before jumping immediately, to give the players breathing room in the story to go around. Maybe it's like, okay, yeah, no, we completed that and we have to decide how are we going to rebuild afterwards. And it wouldn't make sense just to jump right into the next action scene in that case. But, sometimes though, that doesn't necessarily mean that every time there needs to be more like rebuilding and fixing and things like that it then needs to be at the beginning of the session. If you want to do your immediate race beginning, you are going to want to make sure, for example, that your players have leveled up their characters and made those kinds of decisions before you start. So that might be, maybe you actually have some of that leveling up stuff happen at the end of your session, and then have your players complete it in between sessions, or just entirely in between session if you have a group that you can trust to level up between sessions. So that you don't have the, oh, wait, I didn't pick my feats. Oh, wait, we still have to figure this stuff out. Paperwork happening in the beginning. If you can clean that up at the end of the session or between sessions, then it's easier to start in the middle.
Right. So you have to think about how you're going to do that. And it is possible, even though maybe you finished a climactic arc, that you can still use an immediate race beginning to the next session. But it might be something that's a little more lighthearted. Like if the players and the characters wanted to just rest at a tavern, maybe there's a tavern brawl that starts the next session rather than like suddenly a bunch of undead murder the barkeep and puppet around the barkeep's body as like a sock puppet.
So then it's like, okay, we did the tavern brawl, and then we're talking about and because the players had said, say that at the end, one of the things that's very useful for that is if at the end of that last session you get a sense of which of the players want to do next. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to gather some information to figure out leads for where they might want to go next. And then you can say like, oh, tavern brawl, and then so the story then is like, oh yeah, well, you guys were at this tavern trying to get some information, or you guys were at this tavern blowing off steam after your last adventure, and then.
Yep. So we had a question from chat about whether this applies to Pathfinder 2nd Edition or D&D 5th Edition. It really applies to most tabletop RPGs, except ones like Blades in the Dark that already by default start you in the middle, because you don't need additional techniques to start in the middle. In fact, like we said before, you can go into those other RPGs and grab some of their mechanics or ideas to help you start in the middle more easily. Now, there was a comment in chat from Rising Star Pathfinder 2nd Edition that said you might be able to use playing the bad guys a little bit as a way to get an animated race or something similar beginning. Kind of like at the beginning of an episode of Columbo where you would actually see the murderer do it before you watched the rest of the episode. Now, I would caution that you need to know your players for whether or not they're going to like this. Some players love getting a chance to play the bad guys. Some of them, and I'm kind of included in this, don't like playing the bad guys because I feel like especially when I just played the good guys and now I'm playing the bad guys in contravention to that, and I go back to playing the good guys, which was the example that was given there. That is just how to get me to never play it, because then I feel like if I don't play the bad guys or I play them poorly, then my good guys, it's better for my good guys.
But if you play them well, then you're like, oh man, I'm doing the work.
Especially if it's like I remember when Warcraft 3 came out, and like, I was playing some good guys, and then they had me play a campaign where like it was about getting corrupted, becoming evil, doing horrible atrocities, and then making the bad guys do well. And I was just like, forget this. I don't want the bad guys to do well. I'm not going to work hard so that I can erase everything that I previously did. These guys are bad. I'm just going to stop it. So I stopped playing the campaign. And so I'm not saying I'm at the average player. I think a lot of players love playing the bad guys.
But if the bad guys in that case aren't like recurring villains, but this is sort of like this is the first time that you're meeting this particular opposition, and it's more like that you're setting the building blocks for the challenge in some way, then I think that's more likely to be successful in that way. Also, making sure the bad guys aren't doing the kinds of things that would break sort of the social contract of your group. So the players are like, oh man, I just don't even want to play someone succeeding at this thing.
Yep.
If you can do that, one of the advantages of it is that there's not going to be that's not what my character would do, because this is a new bad guy group and you're sort of defining how they work together with the players collaboratively.
Yes. I think also a way to be successful about playing the bad guys is to not do the thing where you specifically play the good guys in campaign X, then the bad guys in the middle who are literally in the same story and going against it, and then the good guys, or even just two. But instead, having the bad guys do something that is unrelated completely to the main plot, and might be even something that the PCs kind of would have wanted to do. So minor spoilers for a very long time ago Pathfinder Society scenario. Back in the day, the Master of Spells, Aramzay, in the Pathfinder Society was a big jerk who would constantly insult the player characters. To be fair, sometimes the player characters were rowdy murder hobos. To be fair to Aramzay, but he was a jerk. And so there was a special adventure where you could play members of evil organizations like a Legion of Doom that teamed up, and they usually in Pathfinder Society they just always lose and get knocked around. But this group, since you're playing them, infiltrates the Pathfinder Society to kill Aramzay, who a lot of people just don't like Aramzay. And so, but their characters can't kill him because he's like their superior. And so that's very different than, like having a thing where it's like, this season we're going to, restore the Haojin tapestry, and then you have an adventure where they destroy the Haojin tapestry, and it's like, why would I want to, for me at least, why would I want to play that? It reverses everything that I did in all the other ones. Whereas the one with trying to kill Aramzay is like, oh, that's interesting because it's just a totally different plot line.
And I want to point out something that Rising Star said in chat here, which is really good. Maybe for your party, a scene of seeing the bad guy is more appropriate than playing them. Because then it gives the players the same information without them feeling like they're the ones who are undoing things. But also lets them kind of behind the curtain.
There are a whole bunch of RPGs that just flat out have those Columbo-style villain scenes in them. It's more common in Japanese tabletop RPGs. And that's also why Fabula Ultima puts that rule into itself, even though it is not a Japanese tabletop RPG, but it takes some cues from it since it's trying to be similar to JRPGs in general.
And I see a good question from Rohit too. How would you use in Media Race for pre-made adventures? I would say look for an encounter that sort of fits that style of what we were talking about, where it's one that it's pretty uncomplicated what's going on. You're being attacked by something that's not like, oh, let's stop and reason and figure out what the context is. And it throws you right into the action. So then you can start with doing that encounter, and then maybe like a little bit of the stuff around it, and then go into a bit of a flashback.
So in Media Race doesn't have to be a combat, to be clear. It often is because there's a lot of good reasons why if you're already going to jump somewhere, that jumping to action can help, depending on your group's psychology and dynamics. But if you want to see a good example of how to use in Media Race for pre-made adventures, well, I've got a link for you, assuming I can find it, because it's on this channel. I used the techniques of in Media Race to completely skip like a significant portion of the beginning
It'd be live, wouldn't it?
Here it is.
Oh,
no, it's not.
Right, of course,
to completely skip the beginning
Make sure it doesn't start playing, so.
no, I muted it.
Sounds good.
I thought ahead. Of the Jewel of the Indigo Isles adventure path, I've just put a link in chat. And you can watch, I skipped right to, not a combat, but being in a tavern to gather a little bit of information so that I didn't even have to describe what the quest was as much, because I could do that sort of in the first scene. Having skipped like a briefing with the royal family and some investigation that was around the town, and just fast forwarded right into a tavern that then led them directly from there into a combat area. And we did what took, I think, like 4 sessions for my group to complete in one session that was like 2 hours long on the video, and was much shorter than one of the 4 sessions.
Yeah. So in that case, then what you're doing is you're skipping past some more of the exposition stuff, some more of the information gathering stuff, and getting right into the part that's like the most interesting. Like if the adventure had you like, oh yeah, you need to follow these 7 clues to find the place where you can go talk to this person who can give you what you need to continue with the adventure. Or, if it had kind of more like a yak shaving type thing and you just want to go straight in. And then you're going to want to decide with that, am I doing it where I am going to have flashbacks and fill in that other stuff earlier on? Or am I just saying, you know what, my characters, my players, they're not going to want to do this long section. They're gonna want to just they're not gonna want to go. They're just gonna want to get into the action. They don't care about this longer section at the beginning, so we're not gonna go back.
Exactly. And sometimes it's appropriate not to go back to the beginning. It depends on your players. It depends on the specific situation, and maybe you don't know when you started whether you were gonna go back or not, and you ask. And if the players say, nah, let's just keep going from here, then you give them like a summary of some of the things that you might have said if you did go back.
And you can also determine that in part by seeing, are the players asking you a lot of questions about what happened in the past and like how you got there? Then that's a good sign that you might want to go back and spend more time on looking at what happened there. If the players are just like, yeah, we're here to kick some teeth in, or like, oh yeah, we're here to find the path to the magic treasure or whatever. We don't necessarily need to know all this other stuff. Especially if they're the kinds of players who are more just like not as invested in all the details of the lore, and they just want to get straight into the action.
That's right. So I think that really covers a lot of what I wanted to say about starting in the middle. And hopefully by giving our little silly example where we started in the middle, we showed at the very least how it can be a technique that changes and shifts things up. Because you might have been expecting the just, I'm Mark Seifert, I'm Liz Palmer, and this is Arcade Mark.
Yep.
So, at this point, I would say please like, subscribe, join if you want to join us, and let's vote for our next Saturday episode.
Let's give XP to all of our live
viewers. We'll do that while the vote is voting.
So
there have already been 2 votes for 3 and a vote for 4.
2 3s and a 4? Okay,
yes,
awesome.
There sure have. So we're adding...
And who are those voters so we don't double count?
Those are... the votes for 3 are Rohit and David, and Rico has voted for 4.
Rico have voted, and we have 2 3s and a 4. Awesome.
So the votes are Build a Monster Workshop is 1. That will build a monster on the stream. Then Ask Arcade Mark, Save My Game Q&A are asking us questions to help your game. Number 3 is reskinning as a GM tool in your toolkit. Number 4 is we'll play some kind of a game on here. And number 5 is other. So Rising Star says, let's play a game. So we've got 2 for a game and 2 for reskinning.
Rico saying, darn, I can't vote again. Because you read that I voted.
I have.
Must keep it fair, folks.
We're going to keep everything fair in the votes. So right now it's a tie. That means that if you are watching this and you see the options that I just put into chat, you can vote for 3 or 4, and if you do, that is the one that will win.
Otherwise, we're going to need to determine by rolling.
By rolling a die to determine the winner. And if we have to determine the winner with the die, you never know what it's going to be. So vote for 3 or 4. Don't throw your vote away by voting for 1, 2, or 5. Otherwise, I'll start rolling a die now, and we'll see if a die is necessary. Oh, I see. Yeah, this is not Google, so it does not automatically roll a die. All right, there we go.
You have to select differently. I'll show you later.
Well, no, it worked. I saw it. But it turns out that possibly Neil has voted for reskinning. So
awesome.
We're going to do reskinning. 3 wins by 1 vote. It shows every vote matters.
Indeed.
All right, everybody. So next Saturday, we're going to reskin and figure out how to use the technique of reskinning most quickly, easily, and powerfully in order to do what you want without having to spend hours of creating things.
This can be for character abilities, this can be for creatures, this could be for terrains and environments and maps and all sorts of things. There's a lot of ways you can use reskinning to save yourself work.
Find out more in the actual episode. Take care, everyone, and have a good weekend. And yes, that next Saturday is the Saturday after Thanksgiving, but we are still going to be around to do that episode as far as we know. So, bye!